And now please meet Rajon. So really briefly, Rajon and I go way back. Rajon started a couple of communities, and together we started TechKnowCon, and we met when I was at Twitter. I think Rajon, you were just starting at LinkedIn, and we kind of met together over coffee, compared notes, because we were sort of in the same boat, solving the same problems at similar companies, and just stayed friends ever since. And so I always love when Rajon comes and shares some of his practical experiences, lessons learned out in the wild, building technical training and documentation at LinkedIn. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and just pass it on to Rajon.
Cool, thank you, Marco. Just give me 1 second. All right, hi, how's it going, everyone? Want to thank everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak today, and hopefully I can add some value to your day, sharing with you some of the things I've learned throughout my career and how we implement technical training at LinkedIn. Just a little bit about myself. So, you know, I actually started off as a programmer, as a software engineer. Studied my undergrad in a very small school called Stevens Institute of Technology, right in Hoboken, across the river from New York. Started out as a programmer, actually, in the pharmaceutical industry. Quickly pivoted to learning and development. This might date me, but I actually started off my career kind of as a Flash developer. I don't know how many of you actually remember Flash or even know what Flash is. But back then, the easiest ways to get a job in Flash was either developing games or developing some kind of interactive media. Flash video was a big thing back then, and online learning. So online learning way back then was kind of still in its infancy, and it was heavily relied on Flash. And one thing that I started noticing, you know, involving myself in online learning back then, was that it felt really boring to me as the developer. It kind of felt like glorified PowerPoint presentations. I think it's evolved a little bit since then. But you know, I did online learning of Flash, and it was really unsatisfactory. So that really elevated my interest in instructional design. I wanted to be proud of things that I built, and that kind of pivoted my career to instructional design, and really gained a passion of how to create really satisfying and engaging content for learners. And I feel lucky, you know, for the past 8 years, I've been at LinkedIn, mostly focusing on engaging our technical employees or software engineers into high quality training, both in the classroom, online, and even, you know, expanded my scope to include documentation and knowledge sharing as well. All right, so that's a little bit about me. So before I move on, I'm going to quote some things here. You know, I've a lot of the sources that I use are from books that really mean a lot to me, and from folks that have taught me along the way. One of the books that helped me pivot from programming to instructional design was a book by Michael Allen. He is one of the co-founders of Macromedia, and they have their own company called Allen Interactions. His first book, Creating Engaging E-Learning, was a really pivotal book for me to make that shift. And Leaving Addy for Sam is that book that helped me understand some of the concepts that I'm going to share today. I learned a lot about Agile software development and Agile management from a company called Silicon Bay Training, who's one of our vendors here at LinkedIn. I think one of their folks here is in the audience, Ryan Richardson, but there's so many books and so many courses out there on Agile, but Silicon Bay Training is who taught me most of what I know about Agile development. And I'm also going to quote some content from a book that really gave me a good perspective on what Agile really means in a practical sense. So that book's the Lean Startup by Eric Ries. So I'll refer to those books as we go on. So there's a lot to go through. I don't know if we're going to go through everything today, and if we don't, maybe we could have a part 2, and that'll be exciting to meet everyone again. But before we go into some of the prescribed methods of how we actually apply Agile, I think going through some of the concepts is important, and especially how we can use those analogies for creating courses in instructional design. So I want to go through how do we learn. And so, learning is a very broad term. And, we can look at learning as kind of a superset of how we acquire skills and knowledge. So it's really huge philosophical term. Everything I'm going to talk about here is very specific to how we define training. And training is really a subset of the whole world of learning. So what is training, right? So training is a few things. But to me, the most interesting characteristic of training is really how we classify and organize what we observe and map those observations in our brains. And we're able to recall that information when it's needed, and really conditioning our brains to make decisions and responding to certain situations. So recognizing patterns, how people, adults recognize patterns, is a very key aspect of training. So how do we start recognizing certain patterns? We do that with practice. So the more we repetitively do things, the easier it is for our brains to recognize patterns. These are all part of like standard principles of neuroscience, and you can probably Google a lot about learning neuroscience that tell you the same exact things. But the great thing about practice is that it gives us an opportunity to do things like fail quickly, to make mistakes, to experiment. And by doing these things repetitively, we're able to recognize certain patterns. That's amplified by being given feedback and reflecting on that feedback, being able to make mistakes, do it again, and be given the right information, maybe from someone who is more experienced to provide that feedback. And even in a self-paced environment, feedback is given in many different ways. Feedback can be given through certain sound, like a buzzer. Feedback's just not only a person telling you something. It can be given in many different ways. And for those that play video games, you're also aware, like feedback can be things like haptic feedback on a controller every time like you're hit, or the screen shaking. So there's many different types of feedback that can go into training. So all of these elements are basically conditioning you to grow and develop in different ways. And I like to make an analogy of kind of like training for a race or training for something athletic. And when you first condition, when you first start training yourself to perform a certain way, like competing in a race, you don't start off great, but that's why you train, you practice, you condition your body to perform at a better incremental level every time you repeat something. So same thing, training is kind of like doing that for our brains. All right. Now, for training engineers, I like to optimize for what really helps motivate those engineers and feel rewarded. Some of those things are like including elements of problem solving. Problem solving really helps engineers tap into their DNA of what they enjoy. And these are things like experimenting. These are things like trial and error, reverse engineering, figuring out how things work. So that's problem solving. Then adding challenge to that. One of my favorite YouTube instructors, I love this saying that, YouTube fitness instructors, and I do that since we're working from home. He says, there's never change without challenge. And I love that saying. It's something that I love to apply to the training programs we have at work. And so challenge is interesting because it needs to be balanced in a very certain way. When we first started doing certain training programs at LinkedIn, they're very rudimental and fundamental and easy. one thing I noticed is that the harder we make some of our courses, the more that we increase those challenges, our feedback responses start to go up. And the more that you add challenge, the more reward and satisfaction that you're given once you're able to overcome those challenges. So what you see here are also very similar to things like video game design. So if any of you are interested in seeing, how like video game design could be applied to stuff like training programs, feel free to Google like Super Mario Brothers World 1-1 training. And that the first level in Super Mario Brothers is a really good example of how to design things in a certain way to really train someone to incrementally be better at something. All right. I also want to go through two concepts of content-centric and learner-centric. So content-centric is probably the most traditional way we can think of training. A saying I like is to describe this is sage on stage. It's when information is being presented to you most of the time. So what I'm doing right now, ironically, I'm doing a content-centric presentation to you. It's definitely not learning-centric, and I apologize for that, but we'll understand what's going on. So here, most of the information is being presented, and it relies really heavily on the pedagogy of adolescence and dealing with memorization and information retrieval. It's more or less just passive learning. It's not always bad. I learn a lot from content-centric, and I'm providing content-centric right now. And it's really good for those that are highly, highly motivated. That doesn't require an additional element of motivation to achieve a level of development. So that's content-centric. For the training that I'm going to talk about here is mostly about learner-centric a design model. A lot of times I don't see this applied at companies. And when I do, I get pleasantly surprised. Now, what learner-centric is mostly focusing the learner experience in a sequence of activities. And each of those activities get incrementally more challenging as learners progress through a program. And so here, activities take the center stage. This is where the experiences, this is where the practice and skill building happens. And sometimes not much content is even provided at all. Some of the best learner-centric programs I've seen actually ask the learner to seek out content on their own. A lot of our own training programs at LinkedIn do that as well. We do that in our own engineering bootcamp at LinkedIn. And therefore, we're also training not only for them to develop new skills of how to engineer and develop software at LinkedIn, but we're also training them of how to find the right content, how to find the right documentation that could help them overcome certain challenges. And in the end, especially as far as the technical audience, fulfilling these challenges, overcoming these obstacles within a safe environment becomes incredibly rewarding. It gives them quick wins early on in their career and in their experience of onboarding. Right? So here's a visual. All right, this is probably what most people are familiar with. This is what content-centric looks like. This could apply to either an in-person classroom training, or this could also apply to, self-paced online training, where it starts off with an introduction. Maybe they give you the learning objectives. You start off with a topic, maybe you see a video, some facts and data, start off with another topic, and then gets interrupted with an activity or quiz. And this is where, information recall. Did you remember everything that I gave you so that you could answer this question? So this is kind of the standard format for content-centric learning. Now, on the flip side, this is what learner-centric programs look like. It's all centered around large amounts of practice and activity. For software engineering, most of that activity is in the form of labs, code labs. labs to develop using certain tools. That's what the majority of our training programs try to enable, is using tools, being productive, learning certain frameworks and programming languages. So how this format looks like, usually some context, like an introduction, and just enough content to get you started doing some work. And as you see here, activity 1, activity 2, activity 3, progress and get incrementally harder as you go. All right, so that's learner-centric. I went through a lot already. I'm more, if you want to type in the chat and if you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer that, because I know I'm going through a lot here and I'm delivering in a content-centric way. All right, so how do we get there? So if anyone here is familiar with instructional design, you should be familiar with ADDIE, just analyze, design, develop, implement, evaluate. This is the basic framework of instructional design, originally called instructional systems design, I think founded in the 50s, usually in a military training context. But in the program management world, in the software development world, it's really based on what's called a waterfall model. Now, the key aspects of a waterfall model is that it is heavily dependent on the completion of dependencies. So as you go through each of these phases, analyze, design, develop, it's really dependent to make sure that the previous phase is completed before you start the next one. Now, one of the biggest challenges of that is that it assumes perfection or near perfection of the previous model, of the previous phase, I'm sorry. Now, this provides some challenges. One of the biggest challenges of this is that because it provides perfection, it makes it incredibly hard as you go through the later phases, incredibly hard to adapt to change, adapt to rapid change. And so it becomes more expensive to make changes in the later parts, in the develop phase, in the implement phase, to make necessary changes that could affect things like timeline. It could affect things like cost. It could affect things like even having a good experience for your learner, because they want to squeeze in all these changes in the last minute, that it becomes a wall of text or someone just speaking nonstop. So this is called the waterfall model. I'm not saying that this is not the right way to go, but as far as the type of learning, the type of training that I just described, the learner-centric, this is not the most optimal way to create that kind of training. So there is an iterative model, and many folks in the industry call this iterative model Agile. All right. So Agile enables people to make incremental changes and improvements based on a prototype by generating quick feedback and learning from observations of how other people respond to that prototype. All right, this is based on the Agile software development practices. Within the Agile software development practice, there's an Agile manifesto, and if anyone's wants to learn more about this Agile manifesto, feel free to Google it. But in that manifesto, they talk about why they are suggesting this kind of model, because they want to focus on interactions over process, right? They want to focus on actually examining working solutions rather than very comprehensive documentation. And they want to be flexible and respond to rapid change over following a straight path, over following a plan. So that's Agile. So this is something that I've experimented throughout my career, but until I I read a book called The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. It didn't really internalize with me in a certain way. And so I just want to quickly share some of those principles that I learned in that book with everyone here. And I hope that this kind of thing kind of makes more sense. So in the book, The Lean Startup, there's kind of a framework. The framework is called Learn, Build, and Measure. The purpose of the book of Lean Startup is to kind of advise people who have startups how to create a sustainable business through quickly releasing products and ensuring value to their customers. And the way they do that is this framework, which is learn, build, and measure. Very agile kind of framework. Here, it all starts with forming a hypothesis based on observations, right? You have a hypothesis, and then you build something quickly. Once you build something as quick as possible that is at least functional, then you're able to measure that. You're able to measure how other people respond to that. And based on that behavior of those, how those folks respond to your product, you could quickly learn and adapt and iterate and improve your product as quick as possible. And now the whole goal of this framework, how it could be successful, is to think about how you could always accelerate this feedback loop. All right. When it becomes something really functional, it becomes something called an MVP, or a minimum viable product. So a minimum viable product really is the smallest, scrappiest thing you can build where you could actually measure and learn from. So the whole focus is you have all these whole set of requirements. It becomes really overwhelming. And you start to form a hypothesis based on all these requirements and just build something really quickly and just see how people respond to it. It's the most, cost-effective solution while reducing any risks of failure. Or maybe it's a good way to fail quickly and learning from that failure. All right. So, going through this whole feedback loop is really called validated learning. And it's kind of scientific, it's based on running experiments that allow us to test different parts of our vision very quickly and seeing how what our assumptions are can actually be turned into value. All right. So it's when I kind of grokked this and really understood this is when I really learned how to apply this to actually developing training programs and creating high sustaining training programs. All right. There's lots of iterative instructional design models out there. There's the one that I learned is called SAM, which is Successive Approximation Model. This is from Michael Allen from that book, Leaving Addy for SAM. There's also another concept called Llama. I think it's like Agile methodology. There's many of them out there, but this is the one that I learned. They all basically follow the same principles. It's that iterative building and learning and evaluating. But this is kind of what that process looks like. How are we doing on time? Good? Okay, cool. So that was just an overview of the concept. So let's start designing. All right, let's start designing. So, I took from SAM and I took from, what I learned in the Lean Startup and kind of simplified the process for myself. So, this Agile instructional design process really starts out with like a needs analysis and then a design kickoff, a whole iterative phase of rapid prototyping, and an iterative phase of development, finally launch. I'm going to go through each of these phases. I'm going to start off with needs analysis. And I could really go on for a really long time for needs analysis. And if you're interested, please let me know. It's something I'm passionate about. But I'm just going to go through this quickly because the other parts are more interesting. So needs analysis, the most important thing of needs analysis, this is what a lot of people kind of miss sometimes, is that with needs analysis, you need to validate the need for training. And that's sometimes a hard thing to grasp, right? Because sometimes you just need to justify your job. Of course, we need training. But the thing is, if training's not really needed, if training's not the solution, then it's hard to actually be successful and add value. So conduct a needs analysis, make sure that training is the right solution. And if it is the right solution, know what kind of business or behavioral impacts you need to know to know whether or not your training is successful. So that's needs analysis. I'm going to go into design kickoff. So once you know that training is needed, that's validated, let's set up like a meeting with your stakeholders and SMEs. So this design kickoff is more or less a brainstorming meeting. It's fun. I meet with SMEs, stakeholders. Typically ours is like 2 to 4 hours long or longer because there's a lot to talk about. Many times, this, because everyone's really busy at work, you need to separate this across a few days. That's fine. That's fine. It's fun. The key part of this is understanding and defining what your learners need to do. There is kind of a framework I follow, and we call it user story-driven learning objectives. And it's a little bit different. I'll go through it in a little bit. But once you define what your user stories are, what your user story-driven learning objectives are, you can start crafting and designing activities. And these activities will be, the makeup of your learner-centric training. All right. So what is a user story? A user story is basically just a general explanation of a software feature that's written in the perspective of someone who will use that software. The reason why it's framed that way is so that you can define high value from a user perspective. And similarly, you can articulate, similarly in instructional design, you can write learning objectives this way so that you can be very explicit about the measurable and actionable outcomes of your learner. Typically, people, when people try to define learning objectives, they ask subject matter experts. So, what do they need to learn? What are some of the requirements of this course? And a lot of those learning objectives are extremely passive. They're not actionable. They're not measurable. Some of the first things I say when we start off this brainstorming meeting is, what does the learner need to do? And please tell me without using these 3 words. Don't use the words understand. Don't use the word learn. Don't use the word define, because those things are not actionable. And so, really framing things like a user story can really help drive that kind of brainstorming and conversation. I see a question here from Jasmine. With your kickoff brainstorming, are you able to do any asynchronously or in real time? Typically for us, it's in real time. I don't know if anyone else on my team is here. Maybe they can respond, but my own personal experience has always been real time because it requires a lot of interaction and iterative brainstorming that requires a high response time. Okay, cool. So here's an example of how we can frame things like a user story. So as a software engineer, I can write testable code so that bugs can be minimized when my software is released. This is like overly simplified, but I just thought of something in the tech learning context that some people might respond to here. All right, so that's an example. So once you have your, so real quick. So when crafting learning objectives, try to think about those user stories, or maybe we could call them learner stories now that I think about it. Think of those learner stories, how they'll actually apply this in the real world. My rule of thumb is usually one of these user-driven learning objectives, these activities can be rather comprehensive. And so the way we estimate how long something is 2 or 3 learning objectives really fulfills about an hour worth of learning. All right. I have a question from Raymond here. When creating learning outcomes, do you aim for modular learning outcomes or very specific learning outcomes? Modular, let's say 7 for a 2-week training program. I would say that's dependent on what the topic is, Raymond. It's depending on how things are designed. If it enables practicing and recalling what has been done previously, I think doing things across 2 weeks can be possible. But yeah, happy to chat more. All right. So once you have your list of learning objectives, there's a framework of how to convert those learning objectives into an actual activity. So here you see a CCAF framework. This is from that book, Leaving Addy for Sam. I found this incredibly effective as far as having really good engrossing activities. This was originally modeled for e-learning or online learning, but it could be easily applied to in-person classroom, if that's what your context is. So let me just go through each of these quadrants. So CCAF stands for Context, Challenge, Activity, and Feedback. And each of these are the prime elements that an activity should have. An activity should have context. So what context is where or when new skills will be applied. Challenges are actually what creates a sense of urgency for your learner to actually develop and perform better. A lot of ways that I try to frame challenge with my subject matter experts are things like, what are some of those gray areas? If it's about using a tool, what are some of those gray areas? What are the high frequent support tickets you get? Let's narrow in on that and let's see why it makes that challenging. All right. So activity, move on to activity. Activity is the actual experience that elicits a response from the learner, and hopefully that it results in a meaningful outcome. And feedback is, it's the validation or the reinforcements or even the consequences that actually create aha moments where cognition actually happens. So many times, especially in self-paced training, a lot of the content part is in the feedback. It's where the learning happens. If the learner fails, they're given feedback so that they can have that aha moment and correct themselves. So this is a framework that I follow. I'm sure there's other frameworks out there of how to create activities. But usually in a brainstorming session, I follow this in a clockwise manner, starting with context, then going to challenge, then activity and feedback. And we could go through an example. I have a great example coming up soon. I have a question from Gus. I've been trying to capture more user stories, but I'm running into some difficulty connecting with folks being remote. Any thoughts on how effective it would be to send out MS forms? Okay. As far as user stories, for one thing, it might be good to try to narrow your stakeholders or your audience to 1 or 2, 3 folks, not a whole bunch. Hopefully that these folks are very well aware of what their user pain points are. But if anything, you can probably just solicit actionable user stories from your audience. But unfortunately, I haven't had the same challenges, but would love to talk more. So feel free to reach out in Slack later on.
Rajon?
Yep.
5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, let's see if we can quickly go through this. Happy to have a part 2. Okay, just because I am a work from home dad now, I'd love to use an example of making breakfast for my kids. So I'm going to frame my user story. As a parent who just woke up, I can cook breakfast for my children so that my children are no longer hungry. This actually makes me very anxious every morning, hoping that I make them breakfast in time. So it was very relevant to what's going on recently. So I decided to make that an example. Let's go through, the CCAF of that. And I would love, I want to make this interactive. If folks can actually start brainstorming, in what is the context of that user story? And feel free to just add in the chat what you think the context is. Feel free to type away. If not, I could tell you the answers. Breakfast time, meals, eating breakfast, being a parent. There you go. Okay. So what I define too here, it's the morning. I'm at home. And this is what I didn't tell you. I have 2 kids under the age of 10. All right. How about some of the challenges? Some of the challenges here. Okay, I love that. Kids get hangry. Okay, yeah. I actually added that to one of my challenges here. Yeah, I just woke up. Yeah, I'm tired. I'm still sleepy. Can't think straight yet. Oh no, the milk is spoiled. I can't make them cereal. I only have two eggs left in the carton. And here's the biggest challenge, and that gray area that I was talking about before. My children will start whining in 10 minutes. So that gives me that sense of urgency. All right, and because we only have a few minutes left, I'm just going to quickly go through that. So the activity here is make fried eggs. I'll make them a drink that's not included with milk, maybe orange juice, make them toast. And feedback. So as I mentioned, sometimes feedback is key as far as content. So, one, make sure eggs are cooked long enough before you flip them, or else they'll be all soupy and they'll break. Maybe making scrambled eggs, it reduces the chance of me wasting one egg. Someone, Gus said, I only have enough milk for my latte. Of course, same here. And yeah, it's not advised to give my kids under 10 coffee. Hopefully I don't end up doing that anytime soon. So here's kind of like a quick, rapid example of how to start brainstorming within the CCAF context. So now I'm in the rapid prototyping phase. How are we doing on time? Because like I said, more than happy to do a part 2. All right. So building your first prototype. The biggest thing about building a prototype is making sure that it's scrappy. Like, expect imperfect. I typically suggest 1 prototype per learning objective, and just building it as quick as possible so you can receive feedback as quick as possible. So who should test your prototype? All right, like as I mentioned in software engineering, typically activities are in the form of labs. So if you're not in software engineering, what do those prototypes look like for you? Is it a handout in a classroom, or is it a type of interaction online? So that's up for you to decide. In engineering, typically labs. So who will test your prototype? Possibly a new hire who has no context, a peer of the SME, someone who hasn't been really involved with the project, and others who might not be too familiar with that topic. So the more that you showcase and share your prototype with these folks, you get really good information about how people respond to your prototypes. I'll give you one example of why this is really, really valuable. So one of the first projects at LinkedIn that we actually applied this framework to, it was for our build pipeline course. And Build Pipeline course, for those of you that are familiar with software engineering, it's mostly about the continuous integration process of actually releasing software. And so we started building out labs and activities. And once we started exposing this to testers early on in the rapid prototyping phase, we found out that the exercise was too long and the instructions were too complicated to follow. And it didn't leave enough time for our testers to actually start going through the other 4 or 5 exercises in the course. They were just stuck on this first exercise. And because we were able to identify this way early, we were able to simplify that first exercise just enough that they were able to get through the course in the desired time. And the way we were actually able to do that is we were able to develop a patch that they could apply. They could download and apply to their course, so they don't have to do that all manually on their own code. But that was a great first experience, and really validated that this method of developing training actually works for our audience. All right, so building a course. So once you've done through your rapid prototyping phase, and I usually suggest 2 or 3 iterations. For me, basic rule of thumb, 3 times the charm. And then actually going through the development process. And the development process is where you start polishing your course and adding content. What I usually suggest is, as far as content, adding the bare minimum just for your audience to get started. And if you add content, it must align to the prototype. If that content doesn't have anything to do with that prototype, you're out of scope. You're probably heading in the wrong direction. A lot of methods that we do actually point our learners to where the official documentation is, or where a quick start is, to help them get going. All right. So just want to summarize. What does learner-centric looks like? It's just a sequence of activities that incrementally progress and challenge. All right, and here are some results. So one of our most well-known programs at LinkedIn is Engineering Bootcamp, where we actually apply a lot of these principles, especially in the forms of what we call mentor track breakouts, where based on what type of engineer you are, you're kind of thrown into a scenario where you have to start making code changes. So that's Engineering Bootcamp. Prior to Engineering Bootcamp, we had something called Tech Foundations. Tech Foundations was like a one-day content-centric course where information was just presented to you. So Tech Foundations, we usually measure courses through a level 1 survey after the class is done, and then a 30-day survey. That's kind of like level 3. How is it applied to your job? So Tech Foundations actually had a really high NPS. In the NPS world, it had a 65 NPS, which is like a perfect course in the scale of NPS. Eng Bootcamp actually had a lower NPS than that when we first released it. But when we started doing our 30th day survey, those who took Tech Foundations actually gave it a negative NPS, gave it a negative 33, and said, I didn't really learn anything. Which is interesting because 30 days after they told us they didn't learn anything, where right when they were done with class, they said it was great. Now, when we did the same thing with Engineering Bootcamp, we found that our 30-day results were 100 points higher than our previous program, which is plus 38. So just there, it just incredibly shows the value of adding learner-centric type experiences, especially with technical audience, how that value can go very, very far. And that's it. I'm all done. More than happy for questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Rajon. Super cool. So yeah, feel free to ask questions. You can type them in the chat, or if you want, you can possibly unmute and ask them directly. Don't be shy. Books, Rajon? Any other book recommendations from us?
So, hey, Rajon, this is Vidya. I just have a quick question. When you have your brainstorming sessions, typically how many, do you involve all the subject matter experts? And what is the expectation from your program managers who are from technical point of view? Because for one program manager, it's really hard to have a deep understanding of all the different technical areas, right? So how do you set those expectations?
Yeah, so the organizational structure, at least of our training team at LinkedIn, is a little bit different. So we actually have what we define as instructional engineers, and these are folks who have a software engineering or programming background that are very passionate about teaching and helping others. So I think that kind of profile and background helps progress, with interacting with our subject matter experts a little bit more. I hope that answers your question.
I mean, so you involve the subject matter experts at each stage of building the content or building the course, or just at the brainstorming and writing
Oh, okay.
user
Okay.
stories? Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So I would say it depends. We actually have different models of engagement with our folks, and it really depends on capacity of the team. And so, one premium, depending if it's a very highly visible program, we actually do a lot of the development ourselves. So the subject matter experts are really used as a source of knowledge transfer, where our folks actually develop a lot of the labs and activities themselves, or they partner with them to develop it together. Another engagement model is just where we consult. And so where we consult, the subject matter experts actually do a lot of the development themselves.
Cool. Chris had a question. Chris Sheffer.
Yeah, hey, Rajon, great talk. And on your point at the end about the data and the two different programs, it reminds me of some research that I heard about at one point where they actually showed that there was a negative correlation between how much somebody liked a training and how much they actually got out of it. And one of the concepts that's behind that, the way I think about it, is that learning is hard. Like, change is hard. Pain, no pain, no gain. There's got to be some level of uncomfortability or coming slightly outside your comfort zone where the real learning happens, the deepest, most impactful learning. And so if you're like, this was amazing, I loved it, well, then you probably weren't challenged enough to really, bump up against current thinking or mindset or skill abilities. And so you don't actually want that 100%, satisfaction or like. You want them to be a little bit disgruntled, a little bit edgy, a little bit like, and then you get what you get on that. So I think that's super consistent with that other study, which I couldn't refer to. I just heard about it. So sorry, I can't give you a reference, but
yeah, I love that anecdote, Chris. And, a lot of, as you notice, like I spend a lot of time making analogies with fitness, too. And I see a lot of similarities with both, conditioning, both our cognitive skills along with, our physical health.
The brain is a muscle, after all, right?
Exactly.
That's
you don't get change without challenge and putting yourself outside of the comfort zone. And sometimes it'll hurt at first, right? But then you condition yourself and to continually improve until it doesn't hurt anymore. So.
Yeah. Ivan had a question as well.
Yes, I do. Right. Thanks, Rajon. That was a great presentation. I can't prevent, from, thinking of the irony, right? On the first one, to acknowledge that, that you've done, very much, content-centric, presentations, teaching us about, learner-centrics. I mean, you probably had, some constraint, in why, you decided, to end up, choosing this format, right? And my question, would be, don't you think we end up, all having kind of, the same constraint, and we end up going, back to the content-centric, format versus, trying to do the right thing of, e-learning format? So, maybe it was time, maybe it was something else. And I would love to kind of know what was your thinking, right? But still, right, that being said, it was great.
Oh, thank you. No, I would love to answer that. And I brought up that irony a few times. Yeah. I think the biggest goal for this is awareness. And, similar to like watching a commercial or like watching an infomercial or, reading a magazine. It's mostly about awareness. And I just want, this is how I've found success and how our team has found success developing a few things. Just wanted to share it with the community and make them aware that, if you're not already aware that something like this exists, at least you could be aware of it and learn more about it on your own. There's training classes about it. And, I can, I could suggest, the training companies out there that can train you to apply this in your own work. But yeah, awareness is probably my biggest goal. That's why it was like this. And plus, I only had, which I'm already over time, very limited time to share that.
Just quickly, I wanted to go back to Jasmine had a question about MVP and how do you balance that with perfectionism, right? Like, what's the minimal viable in your view? How do you know where to draw the line?
So anything minimum and viable is what actually, what can actually address the outcomes that you're looking for. So even if your first prototype can be your MVP, it just depends, how much time you actually put into it. But my biggest suggestion really is don't put a lot of time in your first prototype. But many times our first prototype are our MVPs.
Got it. And then there was a question from Drew about incorporating assessments, quizzes into design, and how do you kind of balance this with all-day, multi-day projects, especially like I know your Eng onboarding Eng bootcamp is maybe a good example of that, sort of like a longer arc of education. Yeah.
Okay. So as far as quizzes and certifications, so if any of you are familiar with the Kirkpatrick's level of evaluation, quizzes and information retention is looked at as level 2. I'm personally not a huge fan of level 2, mostly because I'm terrible at quizzes. And I'm really sorry, but that's something we really don't apply for our internal training. This might be different, and might have different objectives if you do like external customer training where certification is necessary to do their jobs. However, I have to be very honest with you. I don't have that much experience as far as certification. It's something we don't apply internally.
It wouldn't be certification like external, but just validation that the students have learned what they've learned, aside from applying it in labs and exercises, but some way to maybe show management that there's a way to measure the learning too.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I mean, because these courses are designed even to demonstrate some kind of outcome, I would say the progression of these activities really demonstrate that a learning outcome has been made. A lot of our training programs, they can't even get to the latter activities without achieving success in the former. In our engineering bootcamp, we do this interesting thing where our students actually demo what they've built in their labs. So sometimes the best ways of learning is to teach. And so at the end of our engineering bootcamp program, they get this opportunity to teach what they've learned and demo what they've built. There's in our program, there's a sense of open-endedness. So, it's not necessarily 100% prescribed instruction, but there's also open-endedness. And, our engineers seem to be very motivated to kind of like share the new things that they've learned and what they've built out of it.
Yeah. Anne had a question about the levels of assessment. And I assume it's, Anne, you're thinking Kirkpatrick levels. And I assume, Rajon, that's what you think by levels, right? Like at level 1 is Kirkpatrick 1 and so on. So that may be a good conversation at some point, how we think about various levels of assessment.
Yeah. Kirkpatrick level 1 being the smile sheet, level 2 meaning the quiz, level 3 meaning measuring how they've applied it within their first X number of weeks or months after the course, and level four meaning business impact or return of investment.
Yeah, and of course the trick is how do we measure, especially 3 and 4, right? That's the holy grail that everyone's trying to get to. So that may be an interesting conversation for another time.
Yep. Yeah, would love to. Maybe that's a good opportunity for a whole panel discussion in the future.
Yeah. Cool. Any other questions, comments?
Cool. Oh, by the way, there is a book I'd love to share with everyone. I know there was a question about a book earlier. So there is a learning thought leader here in Bay Area. His name is Dr. Clark Quinn, and he recently wrote a book called Millennials, Goldfish, and Other Training Misconceptions. And it's funny and it's true, and has some really great anecdotes in the book of what not to do in learning, anti-patterns. So I highly recommend this book. It's by Dr. Clark Quinn.
Cool. I think at some point it may make sense to have maybe a channel in TechKnowCon Slack to just share the resources. So this would be super valuable to share. You mentioned a couple of books, so just to kind of have them somewhere offline as well. So it's a little bit more permanent. Cool. Well, with that, I just wanted to thank Rajon for another awesome talk. Yeah, lots of learnings in that, especially experience sharing from all the work you're doing at LinkedIn. Briefly,
thank you, Marco, for having me. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. And like I said, hope you got some value out of it. So appreciate it.